Welcome to the Not So Long Talk. I'm your host, Nathan Samrati, and I'm joined by my best friend and co-writer,
Caden Zimmerman.
We have a book to review called Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, and how George and Lenny show their friendship to each other.
Okay, first of all, we can see how Lenny and George are not very close in the beginning of the book, where we read about them running from an angry mom because Lenny got into trouble. He's not the very brightest out of all of them. Now, George wasn't directly involved because, Lenny just follows him around like a big puppy, right?
We can see this directly on page 7 where George tells Lenny, and he says, "Okay," George said, "and you ain't gonna do no bad things like you done in Weed, neither." Lenny looked puzzled. "Like I done in Weed? Oh, so you forgot that too, did ya? Well, I ain't gonna remind you. Fear you might do it again." So this is the first time we see an act of friendship. It wouldn't be the last, though. George has to live with the fact that Lenny was touching someone's dress in Weed. This was an act that was not taken very nicely, and it was mistaken for an act of violence, causing them to skip town, basically, and take a bus to the new area that they gotta go to.
So Lenny isn't, he would never hurt a fly, right? He's just a big, beefy child.
Exactly.
That's in an adult's body because he don't know what's wrong with them, but it doesn't, John Steinbeck doesn't ever describe what's wrong with him in the head. But George likes to joke around that he got kicked in the head by a mule later on in the book. But his favorite thing to do is touch things that are soft, and this woman's dress happened to be very, very soft. And whenever he gets scared, he holds on, which is a problem for him also later on in the book.
We can see why this is a problem, because when he touches this lady's dress and she starts yelling, he freezes. And when he freezes, she starts yelling. Men run in and they see this big man holding on to this little woman. They can clearly see that it is a problem, not taken very lightly either. Yeah. And that problem would cause them to basically skip town and, go somewhere else because they're very wanted in Weed now. Okay, so on page 40, we can see George talking to Slim about Lenny, and it's not quite the nicest out of all of them, but it is him confessing up basically on how he needs to not be as rude to Lenny as he originally was, because they're practically brothers at this point, even though George explicitly explains that he would, kill himself and this such if they were even related or close to related. But we can see that on page 20, George says, if I told him to walk over, oh my God.
You got this, buddy.
Okay, bloopers. If I told him to walk over a cliff, he'd go. That wasn't so damn much fun after a while. He never got mad about it neither. I've beat the hell out of him, and he could have bust every bone in my body with just his hand. But he never lifted a finger against me. George's voice was talking in confession now. Tell you what made me stop that. One day, a bunch of guys was standing around the Sacramento River. I was feeling pretty smart, and I turned to Lenny and says, "Jump in." And he does. He couldn't swim a stroke. He nearly damn drowned before we could get him, and he was so nice to me for pulling him out. So, since George hasn't beat Lenny, because he's realized on how grateful Lenny is to have George on his side. He's grateful to see that Lenny is, there for him and there for each other.
Yeah, George has been taking care of Lenny since Lenny's aunt died a long time ago when they were just kids, and so Lenny has always leaned on George, and George has always had to pull Lenny's weight because Lenny doesn't really know what he's doing half the time.
Like we said, Lenny, he's not the brightest. He's all muscle, no talk, no nothing. So obviously we can see that and how grateful he can actually be for having George. So we can see how this friendship is shown in the last part of the book also by Lenny taking his life. This is a very quick instead of a very long and painful death, because Curly said that he would have shot the guts straight out of him. An act that would be obviously a lot more painful. It would take Lenny way longer to die than it would if he was just shot in the back of the head or whatnot. And we can see this. He says, "Sure, right now, we gotta," said George. And George raised the gun and steadied it. He brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lenny's head. The hand shook violently, but his face set and his hand steadied. He pulled the trigger. The crash of the shot rolled up and down the hills again. Lenny jarred and then steeled slowly forward to the sand. He lay there without quivering. This was on page 106.
So this is probably the worst part of the book. People most likely liked Lenny and thought he was misunderstood, and he really was. I liked Lenny. But this truly was an act of kindness because, well, if someone's wife dies, they're probably really mad, and Curly threatened to make sure he died slow. So George, actually caring for Lenny, he shot him because he cared. And in the end, he's sad that he had to do it because he really did care about Lenny. He actually loved him.
So this was obviously a pure act of kindness. Even if it is the sad truth, Curly, again, would have shot the guts right out of him. So George doing this was just a very pure act of friendship. We're starting to get low on time here, so this has been the Not So Long Talk with your host, Nathan Samrati, and co-writer,
Caden Zimmerman.
Thank you for listening.